Enterprise Institute, and I'm very happy to welcome you here this evening. It's a rainy night in Washington. I'm from New York. I grew up in Brooklyn. So the topic of the movie is interesting to me. It's something that I care a lot about. It's an issue that was troubling to me when I was growing up. And I'm very glad that a partnership between the Wall Street Journal editorial page and Palladium Productions, am I pronouncing that correctly? Palladium Pictures, and Michael and Gina Pack have produced this film for us today. It's the beginning of a series of films on important topics that they are going to be doing going forth. And so this is kind of an announcement of something new and important between organizations that AEI cares a lot about and thinks are doing good work, no question. And also tonight's topic is on something that was very problematic for the city of New York and heartbreaking for New Yorkers like me, but is an issue, an underlying issue, or uncovers and discusses an underlying issue concerning anti-Semitism among some communities that can't be ignored and needs to be faced up to and tackled and addressed directly. And I think this picture is an effort to do that. So with that, now, I've been told that when I call lights, action, whatever, it's going to take a minute. So let the picture play. And then we're going to have a nice panel discussion afterwards. So thank you very much. That was dramatic and very good. And I think I want to introduce our guests and then start a conversation and then open it up to all of you. So immediately to my right is Michael Pack. He was the producer and director along with his wife of that. And this is in partnership with the Wall Street Journal, which Elliot is representing, and the Wall Street Journal opinion page, I should say, Paul Gigot and his team, and also part of the producers. And you, I think, are also the editor of the letters. Is that correct?
That's right. That's an editorial writer.
An extremely and powerful person here to those of us who send letters to the editor, so I've got to be nice to you. And then at the far end is Rafael Manguel, who's with the Manhattan Institute and is, I think, the best criminal justice analyst and commentator in America, and it's really great to have you. I'm Robert Doar. I'm the president of AEI. I'm also a New Yorker who just happens to be living in Washington for a little while. So this is a movie that's close to me, and I'm also from Brooklyn. I know all those neighborhoods. I know all those streets. So I want to start, I think, I want to talk about the idea of doing the movie and what this series is part of, but I'd rather jump right into this particular topic for a minute, and that means I'm going to start with Elliot for just a minute, because you have a kind of analyst look at this, and you have a sense of the history of this, and I wanted to ask you, the African American or Black community and the Jewish community in many ways are allies on many, many things. The Jewish community is the biggest supporter of the civil rights movement in some respects, and great contributors to that. But what is the origin of this tension in New York City? What do you think? Is there something else that is underlying this that is worth describing? And I think for non-New Yorkers, in my own history, I'm thinking of Ocean Brownsville. It goes back longer. There's longer tension here. Can you just give us a little bit of introduction to Black-Jewish relations in New York City?
I'd be glad to. It is a tough question. You do have this history of a Black-Jewish alliance, which people love to talk about, write about. There are all sorts of books one can read about it with disproportionate Jewish support for the civil rights movement and for everything that came with it. And you have something go wrong second half of the 1960s and beyond as the civil rights movement turns over to something more radical, a Black Power movement. And it's interesting, you see some of the arguments that we now have where leading Black Power spokesmen start taking a fierce anti-Zionist stance Snick famously published anti-Semitic cartoons along those lines, really crude sort of things that you would expect from a Nazi publication. And it starts to, I think the break really has something to do with liberalism and us leading Black activists made their sort of parted ways with liberalism. They aimed that at the Jews. Now, they could say anything they wanted about whites in general, and it wouldn't get much of a rise out of people. It actually came to be accepted in a lot of ways. But if you said the same things about Jews, now that was radical. That would get you New York Times coverage. That would show that you really had no time for the system, that you were all about revolution. And you start seeing it with those activists. A very powerful strain of that comes along with the Nation of Islam. And in fact, leading up to the Crown Heights riot, you have the Nation of Islam publishing a sort of pseudo-scientific, pseudo-historical book, The Secret Relationship of the History Between Blacks and Jews, making all of these claims about the slave trade and so forth. It all feeds into this anti-liberal turn. And people heard that on the streets of Crown Heights, these theories of Farrakhan, for instance, on the lips of rioters on the street.
So, Raphael, one of my interpretations of the film is that the cops, the NYPD, an institution I have some great respect for, always had it in its power to quiet the riots.
Yep.
That they weren't. It wasn't out of control. They just didn't do it. Am I right about that? Is the NYPD well led and effective enough to have not permitted any of this to have happened?
In that moment, I think they certainly had the capability, and they demonstrated that when they were finally given the mandate. I mean, that's really what was lacking in that moment, was a mandate from leadership. Yeah. And that's really the story of the NYPD up through that point of the early 1990s, because it had been infected with this idea that there was really nothing that institutions like the NYPD could do about crime and disorder, that these were kind of intractable problems that were just, part and parcel of urban life. It was just something that had to be dealt with and reacted to appropriately. But the reality is there was always something that could be done. There was this well of untapped power, money left on the table, so to speak.
And not just power, expertise,
right?
The discipline of preserving order. The fascinating thing about the movie is that you have a future, a past police commissioner talking about when he was, a precinct commander.
That's right.
And then he became the commissioner, and yet he was describing how his leadership was so poor.
Well, I think it tells the story of how the hands of the potential leaders within the department were really tied from the top, right? I mean, as you note, Commissioner Kelly had been within the department for a very, very long time. There was this, again, untapped sort of source of talent and leadership, and it was all there. It was just really a matter of political will. And unfortunately, it took a really, really terrible thing to kind of turn that tide. And
one other thing, just in sort of the nature of the street, because Mayor Koch used to have an expression with regard to certain kinds of people that would disturb his press conferences, that they were straight out of central casting. President Trump has borrowed that phrase. Maybe it came from somewhere else before that. But when I looked at the film, the disturbers of the peace, the rabble-rousers, they're straight out of central casting. They're not really representing the vast majority of the black community. They're just the loudest, most aggressive, most obnoxious voices. And if somebody doesn't stand up to quiet them, they get their way. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
Well, I think that's exactly right. One of the realities of disorder is that it will fester if you don't step up and address it early on. And I think there was a bit of fear, really. I mean, you know, the 1992 riots out in LA had preceded this, did an incredible amount of destruction to that city. I think there was a hope that if we don't interfere, there can be no chemical reaction that might, you know, make things worse. But the reality is that allowing these things to fester is actually the root of the problem. And you know, we learned that through the mid to the late 1990s with respect to all kinds of crimes, not just riots, but also things like subway turnstile jumping and you know, public urination and public intoxication. The enforcement of these kinds of petty offenses nipped something bigger in the bud. And that really is, I think, the beginning of the story of it. It saves lives, and it creates the conditions for cities like New York to thrive. And you think about particularly outer boroughs in that period of the early 90s, late 80s.
I want you to know, as a Brooklynite, I really resent that term, the outer boroughs. I want to.
Well, I'm
this
also
is
a
term
Brooklynite.
people use, and I get it, but it implies that there's an inner borough. There's the movie set that is Manhattan.
That's right.
And then there's the rest of New York.
That's
okay,
right.
let's just
That's
be
right.
clear about that.
Well, I'm a born and raised Brooklynite as well, so I sympathize. But you know, if you think about the South Bronx, you know, parts of South Brooklyn, I mean, particularly in the Bronx, I mean, there were entire city blocks that maybe had one standing structure. The recovery gave the city the room to grow and flourish and fortify itself against future kinds of problems with disorder, which is, I think, one of the reasons why the sky hasn't quite yet fallen, despite all the best efforts of progressive politicians.
Well, when you preserve order, you can allow for the flourishing of other things, businesses, schools, families. When you don't have order, you can't have any of those things. Okay, so Michael, in the end of the movie, you bring up the topic that is of deep concern to us now, and that is the resurgence of anti-Semitism. And I think there's a reference to campuses, or maybe there's film from Columbia. I'm not sure what's going on there, but I wanted to ask you: how do you relate the two? The Crown Heights anti-Semitic disturbance against Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn, terrible tragedy, awful, and now this new thing that's on college campuses. That's not coming from the black community in Brooklyn. It's coming from something else.
Well, that's true, but I think they are related. I mean, our purpose in these Wall Street Journal shorts is to take an event from the recent past and tell it in a straightforward manner, without a lot of opinion, even though we're in partnership with the Wall Street Journal opinion section. So I try not to put my opinions or the Wall Street Journal's opinions there. We try to give the facts of Crown Heights. But my opinion is that it's really, the key thing that's the same is that, look, Mayor Dinkins, the police commissioner Lee Brown, they're not anti-Semitic. So why didn't they stop the riot for 3 days? As Raphael said, they could do it. And Ray Kelly did it right away and didn't think it was hard. So why didn't they do it? I think they were afraid to stand up to violence from essentially the left side of their party. You know, then it was people like Al Sharpton. Today, it goes under, you know, anti-Zionism.
It's the entire English department at Columbia.
Indeed, that too. So I think they would have no trouble standing up to anti-Semitic violence from the right, you know, neo-Nazis, but they can't stand up to violence from the left. So they hesitated and waited until they themselves were attacked. So I think that's what they have in common.
That's very, you know, it's about courage.
Yes.
And in that way, it's similar, but and it's also anti-Semitism.
Well, there's that, and that's a common thread.
Yeah.
Although, frankly, we are also doing a documentary about the post-George Floyd riots. You know, we're focusing on Seattle, and I think those mayors in places like Seattle and Portland and other cities also couldn't stand up to non-anti-Semitic rioters who were perceived to be on their left. It was their base. They were afraid it would hurt their reelection. Even without the anti-Semitism, they just couldn't stand up to progressive violence, you know, where they would have no trouble, of course, with violence from the right. So it's true that the anti-Semitism is horrible and persists, but I think it's even a bigger issue than that.
It involves, right, and a sort of cowardice about the organized left, and the whole business about what's happened to these students on college campuses and their support for the Hamas, which is, you know, scandalous and outrageous, and it's because they represent marginal populations or
Yeah,
people of
right.
color. And
Sure.
so in that respect, I see what you mean. Now, tell us about this partnership, because I'm in the business of promoting ideas in all kinds of ways. This is new?
Yes.
And so what's Paul Gigot up to here? What's going on?
Well, I believe that both Paul and the Wall Street Journal opinion section and us at Palladium, we perceive that there's really a dearth of documentaries that deal with these sort of things on the right. There's this is a period really of a profusion of even good progressive documentaries on Netflix and Amazon and Hulu. And also, we thought of the New York Times Op-Docs, a series of very successful documentaries in this format the New York Times does. And the Atlantic is something similar, and the New Yorker is something similar. But they all have the same policy perspective. So why is there nothing on our side?
Yeah.
So in talking to Paul, we came up with this idea of Wall Street Journal opinion docs to sort of redress a little bit of that balance. And we hope to do that. And over time, there will be a whole bunch of these that will deal with these issues that have been
And so
neglected.
when we're looking at our digital journal and we're on the Wall Street Journal page, there'll be those too.
Well,
Is that part of the plan?
that's right. I mean, and anyone in the audience could have all their friends watch it.
Yeah.
If they go to WSJ.com and Google "Get the Jew."
And
it's
you've
there.
chosen, and it's 25 minutes, relatively not long. Is that the idea?
So this one is 20. The next one, which premiered this week, which was about Liz Truss's short prime ministership, it's called The Prime Minister versus the Blob. Their version of the administrative state is 35 minutes. So that's sort of the range, 20 to 35 minutes. Enough to see it in one sitting, and that's sort of the length that all these other ones on the New York Times. And
How many a week? How many a month?
Well, we hope we can do, 6 to 8 a year, a couple a quarter.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a great contribution to the public dialogue. I mean, don't you think?
I certainly think so, yes.
Well,
but I'm biased. You
Yeah,
have to ask
yeah.
them if it's a
Yeah.
contribution.
Well, so if you're in the business of promoting ideas that come right of center, we welcome more people into the pool.
Indeed.
That's a good thing.
Indeed.
Okay, so I want to go back to you, Elliot, about the city and about your comment in the piece about the election. Let's just dig down a little bit of that. You said that when Giuliani won, he still only won 3% of the Jewish vote in New York City.
3 more percent.
3 more percent. Oh, his margin, it went up a little.
Than the last
But
time,
the people in the Bronx and Brooklyn,
Staten
Staten Island, who had seen this and were offended by this lack of order, gave Giuliani the margin for victory, and then he changed policies. Tell us a little bit about that and how rapidly it occurred. I mean, is your
Well,
sense of it?
Unfortunately, not rapidly enough. I mean, there had been years and years building up to something like this. I mean, just in the years before the Crown Heights riot, there was the Korean grocery boycott, in which radicals led by Sonny Carson, who I think was in there
Yes.
at
Yeah.
one point, stood outside of Korean-owned grocery stores with signs saying, "Don't buy from Koreans," and worse. And there was a legal injunction that they shouldn't be allowed to picket more than 50 feet from the stores. Word came down from the mayor's office, don't enforce that. And the police let Sonny Carson and those types get away with it. And there had been a series of these incidents. I mean, Tompkins Square riot, 1988. Police officers did do something about it, unauthorized by City Hall. And so what happened? NYPD duty chief lost his job over that. And that message went down. And I think it took outrage after outrage for finally something to snap, something to change. And we heard this as cities were, I guess, have been deteriorating these days, where people say, that's just what big city life is. If you don't like it, move to the suburbs somewhere. That's what people said in those years too. And it's nonsense. It doesn't have to be that way. But people took it, and there weren't alternatives, and to turn to Giuliani seemed, extreme, unusual. Well, things had to get extreme for people to do that.
Well, I would
And
just
he
add, Elliot, that there was the change in leadership. It was an example of elections have consequences, and new leadership, a new team, a new commissioner, a new approach does matter quite a lot. And the city, in the period after the mayor was elected, Governor Pataki was in the governor's office. Bill Clinton signed welfare reform, that also played a role. The city was transformed from 93, 94
Absolutely.
to 2013. I think now, and I'll just ask this, again, we're getting a little bit removed from the issue, but the lack of order and lawlessness depicted in this film, there are similarities to some of the things that happen on the college campuses in the rarefied heights of Columbia. But I don't see that. What I sometimes say is it's gone backwards, but we're not anywhere close to 1990. I'm asking both of you that question. Am I right about that or wrong?
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly not close to 1990. I mean, people forget what New York was like, but in 1990, there were 2,262 homicides that year. In 2017, there were 292 homicides altogether, right? So that problem is much, much different. The city streets are very different. You have a lot more congestion, a lot more traffic congestion, which, by the way, is a barrier to a lot of kinds of crimes because there's no getaway that's very quick, that doesn't, I'm serious. I mean, if you think about drive-by shootings in New York City, they're mostly done on e-scooters and e-bikes as opposed to actually in cars, because even in the outer boroughs, you'll run into traffic, and there's, it won't be very hard to catch you. So yeah, it's incredibly different. I think when you think back on like the reticence that political leaders exhibited in those moments, I think was really driven by a deep sense of risk aversion. I think they thought that stepping up and getting involved would risk making things worse. And it really took the public and their sort of internal sense of, moral clarity to say, no, we don't actually surrender parts of our city to a handful of people who want to be violent. And that expression of anger through the political process, it really did spell the beginning of what is, to my mind, still the most incredible turnaround in urban American history. I mean, it is the single greatest achievement in urban American history to take a city from more than 2,000 homicides a year for multiple years, right? And many, many years of more than 1,000 homicides before that.
And where something like what we just saw could happen.
Right.
Over 4 days.
Right.
And be tolerated.
And now, I mean, has there been a regression? Absolutely. Things are certainly not as good as they could possibly be. But thankfully, we are nowhere near where we were in the 1990s. And the way I like to kind of describe it, right, is if you imagine this water bottle as containing New York City's entire capacity for crime, the way that the city has changed has basically made it so that this water bottle would be 3-4 times the size if it were 1990, right? Our capacity for crime has been reduced by the demographic changes, by the physical changes in the built environment, all of which has made the city less conducive to the kind of crime and disorder that we see. Unfortunately, that's had the effect of kind of masking the bad policy that we've been flirting with in that city, because we have a lot more water in that glass than we really should.
But I think to the riots of 2020, I mean, were those stopped right away? I think they let them go unchecked for a lot of the same reasons. And I wrote an article on the Crown Heights riot for the 30th anniversary in 2021, and this film sort of grows out of that. And that's one of the main things I had in mind, that the city would let something like this happen again. And we're lucky that Al Sharpton isn't, what he was. I think when he lost the weight, something changed. He lost the authority somehow. But if a leader like that were pushing the same kinds of aggressive notes, I mean, a few days before the Crown Heights riot, Al Sharpton says, if the Jews want to get it on, tell them to pin their yarmulkes back and come over to my house and we'll get it on. And he said that over criticism of Professor Leonard Jeffries, who was a crackpot, right? And a condemnation of Leonard Jeffries in the New York State Senate couldn't get the signature of a single black lawmaker in the state Senate. And so, was Al Sharpton a marginal voice? Not at all. Those state senators weren't either. And no one was speaking up against Al Sharpton in those days. Mayor Dinkins was intimidated by him and others. And I think we should watch out for demagogues like that. There is a risk. Things have changed, I grant the point, but I don't know how much.
Well, I'm going to just stick with you on because there was a revelation in the movie that I didn't know, not that I know all this, but I didn't know one thing. And that was the indictment of the Times editor and the reporter saying, I wrote the facts, I sent the facts in and they rewrote it. That clearly is not gone away. That tendency to manage the news or interpret the news has maybe gotten worse. What do you think, journalists?
Yeah, and to fit it into a predetermined frame. Their frame was, there is a black riot, therefore this is a black on white story, therefore we're talking about a sort of voice of the unheard, voice of the oppressed. And so what should we do? We should immediately look to what was done to them. What sort of racism, preferential treatment, etc., and make it a story about grievances in that way. What they missed was that, in Crown Heights, blacks were in 80% majority. And we're targeting a minority group, a specific one. Wasn't a generalized outburst at whites at large. And they couldn't look at what they were seeing. New York Times editors in Manhattan and adjust. They sort of had their story and they went with it. And I think that's a lot of how we see the reporting about what happens on college campuses, a story of two sides clashing, even when it's aggression from one side. And if a group experiences racism, that doesn't mean they can't be racist too.
Michael?
Well, I wanted to slightly change the subject, but picking up on Elliot's, I think in the case,
open up in a minute.
In the case of anti-Semitism today, I think it's much worse than it was in the Crown Heights era, because it's, on college campuses, it is not just, whether Al Sharpton or not was marginal or not, he doesn't speak for the academy the way many do now. And I think you see it, this wave of anti-Semitism across college campuses is pretty shocking to me as an American Jew. And at the time, this is in Elliot's article, and it was a little bit in the film when we had to take it out for time. A lot of the mainstream Jewish groups did not condemn this riot. They were thinking, well, it's off there in Brooklyn. It's dealing with these Hasidic sect. It's not us. It's not Upper East Side Jews. They don't go to our synagogue. They don't go to Zabar's. But they're not us. And later, Abe Foxman, who was then head of the ADL, apologized for not coming out so quickly. But I think today, those very Jews are seeing their sons and daughters attacked on college campuses. And it's a pretty shocking thing, and it's a change. And it's shocking to them. We'll see if it makes a change in the politics of the Jewish community, the 3% that Elliot cites at the end. But I never thought I would see, the protocols of the Elders of Zion sold on college campuses, and a lot of explicitly anti-Semitic stuff said on college campuses in places, like Harvard and MIT and Columbia. I mean, I don't want to agree with the ADL that who cares about those Jews off in Brooklyn, but it's pretty shocking to see it now across the country. So I'm not sure that that's better than it was in 1991.
I don't disagree with that. Okay, let's open it up for questions from the audience. And there's one right there, straight ahead for me. Yeah, that's a good question.
How did you convince Al Sharpton to talk to you?
Well, well, look, I try to be fair to everybody, and I actually think I was fair to Al Sharpton. I mean, I could have made him look worse than that, or you can make anybody look worse the way you cut an interview. So I promised him I would be fair, and we gave the usual argument that if he didn't represent his views, other people were going to characterize him, and this would be a chance for him to characterize himself. So he graciously did agree to be interviewed, and I think that is to his credit. And I have not heard from him or his office, but I hope they do not feel that I distorted his views. So it was tough to get him. I mean, that is sort of a challenge. I also have to say, I think it has to do with the status of the Wall Street Journal. It's nice to have a partner like that. I think he feels rightly that he should speak to them, and I think that is to his credit. And I have to give credit to my son, Thomas, who was an associate producer, who actually negotiated with Al Sharpton's team to get them to agree. So, whatever he said seemed to have worked.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Robert. I'm Roger Pilon. I'm the founding director emeritus of the Cato Institute's Center for Constitutional Studies. The issue of the relationship and the antagonism between Jews and blacks, I think Eliot put his finger on it. Crown Heights didn't begin in the 90s. It began in the second half of the 60s. And I can speak from experience to that because I was a student at Columbia at that time. And I supported myself by driving taxi nights and weekends during that time. It was an era when you got the petitions in the taxi cabs. 3 cab drivers were killed on Memorial Day weekend shortly after I started driving. And this is markedly different from prior to that. Remember, in the early 60s, the Jews and blacks worked hand in hand in the civil rights movement and did so earlier in the 50s as well. After the middle of the 60s, you started to see a change in the climate of ideas, the victimization of blacks, the increase of crime, and all of that was reflected in the faculty that I suffered under at Columbia and others have done ever since. And so I think Eliot was absolutely right to put his finger on that. Ultimately, these issues are rooted in changes in the climate of ideas, and we have to look only to the academic world for the major source of that change. So that's just a comment that maybe you might want to respond to, Eliot and others.
Thank you. Sure. Jews were not targeted by these radical intellectuals because they were the most anti-black, the most racist. In fact, it was something closer to the opposite, that because there was such a successful black-Jewish relationship, Jews became the image of what black cooperation with whites looked like in politics. And that was a liberal approach, working within the system to improve it. And so when it came time for black intellectuals to decide to make a break with that, a hard break, it was against the Jews specifically because they were that image of cooperation, of coexistence, of liberalism, precisely not because they were reactionary or racist or all the rest. That's why it was such a strong message doing that.
I would just add to that something that I'm aware of because of my father's history. The conflict over local control of public schools in New York City in 1969 that centered on Ocean Hill-Brownsville, which is another neighborhood in Brooklyn, broke the relationship between some black New Yorkers and some Jewish New Yorkers because what the Ford Foundation and Mayor Lindsay wanted to do was to break rules concerning merit and seniority and proper administration of public schools, the way that had been done, and allow local leaders, Sonny Carson and Daughtry, I think, was part of this, to fire Jewish teachers who were teaching in those schools and replace them with frankly, less qualified, less capable teachers who happen to be black. And to liberal white New York, liberal Upper East Side New York, liberal Mayor Lindsay New York, who cares? It's just a couple teachers, Jewish teachers in Brooklyn. We don't really care. But to the Jewish leadership and Albert Shanker, it was a violation of the rights of those teachers, and to sacrifice it toward this thoughtless desire to do whatever the black leadership wanted because they were black. And that, the Jews in that leadership stood up against that, and that led to tension as well. And I think that's a story. I don't know if anyone knows the story of Ocean Hill-Brownsville and the school strike. You know, the teachers went on strike for almost a year. It broke the city school system badly, really broke the city. But in this case, in my judgment, the leaders of the Jewish community were standing up for liberalism properly understood. And the rest of the city was willing to forsake it in an effort to, you know, make radical blacks happy. And when you do that, you make a mistake, in my opinion. One last question, and then we're going to go. Yes, question.
I have to preface this in a way. I used to work for Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel, and who used to send me down to meet Bayard Rustin on various issues. So I have a kind of a particular take on this. So I want to ask 2 or 3 questions. And first one is, if I'm not mistaken, Dinkins in the beginning, and you have to fact check this, I think was at a tennis match or a tennis tournament and kind of refused to come back or even deal with this at the time. I specifically remember something to that effect, which would be worth looking at. Also, the Lubavitchers, as you know, at the time were buying, at least afterwards, more real estate because they were expanding. A lot of kids, you know, they have to have a place to learn and a synagogue and other things, which created also that kind of tension of dynamic there at the time. Elie Wiesel was kind of brought in, and they said, this is a pogrom, right? I mean, there's rioting against Jews, and buildings are being burned, and there's graffiti all over. And he was very point specific when it came to the terms of like genocide or Holocaust, and in particular pogroms. And he said, yes, this was pure hate. He said, but it was not a pogrom in that, right, the officials, right, the government at the time did not encourage this. And so he kind of backed off, and of course it's an election time, although Governor Cuomo, you remember, backed Dinkins at the time. And he said, you know, he's a great guy, and, you know, this is just kind of, you know, he did the best he could, and he doesn't approve of these kinds of things. So there was a lot of other tensions at that time. Would you care to kind of address that, what Dinkins was doing during that time, or the, you know, kind of the use of the terms? I know the Wall Street Journal, not Wall Street Journal, the New York Times was involved in this with calling it pogrom and such.
I think that's for you.
Okay. The New York Post used the term, and I think condemned in the New York Times. Although, you know, A.M. Rosenthal may have in the Times. But it's an argument over a word. The argument for using the word would be that the city allowed it to continue and didn't stop it, even though, of course, it wasn't behind it in that way. I mean, maybe more interesting is just that, I mean, you tell people about this and they don't believe that it could have happened in 1991 in New York City, that thousands of Jews had to go into hiding for 3 days, dozens were beaten up, one murdered, elderly Holocaust survivor in the area committed suicide during it. homes destroyed, cars, all of that. And the police decided on a containment strategy. They made a perimeter outside. On the second night, 200 police officers stood there where they were pelted with bricks and bottles from all sides, and while the Jewish neighborhood was being ransacked, and under orders stood there, and many sustained serious injuries, and then got ordered to return to their precinct. And it's been called the most embarrassing moment in the history of the NYPD. But 200 police officers were ordered to turn around and run from the riot. That happened, and they even threatened a job action, police officers, because they weren't being allowed to do anything. It was infuriating. So whatever word one uses, I think it's just unbelievable that the city couldn't get itself to act. I think you wanted to.
Yeah, I was just saying, just adding insult to injury were the scars that were left in that neighborhood for some time. I mean, I was living in Brooklyn at that time, and I remember driving down Eastern Parkway with my father, who, by the way, was a rookie under Ray Kelly in the 7-1, and seeing the lasting damage weeks after this had happened, and feeling the tension in the air, in the fall. It really did leave a lasting mark that I think ultimately is what drove the political change that followed it.
Well, that's why.
Yeah.
That's why it's worth remembering it. I mean, hence the importance of both Eliot's article and the film. I mean, all these people that are New Yorkers remember it, but outside of New York, much less so. I mean, if you're in Texas or Arkansas or Washington State, the people simply never heard of it, and so it's good to bring that to their attention.
And I hate to, I come from New York, politics a little bit, so maybe I'll reveal this. It doesn't surprise me that Mario Cuomo would get it wrong. And with that, we'll call it a day. Thank you very much.
Well, before we go, you want to come up for a second, Gina?
I'm sorry. You guys are going to close it out.
I think we're closing.
We're closing, but we
You close.
we would like to thank AEI for hosting it, of course, and pulling this thing together.
Thank you,
It was
Robert.
fun.
And this is fun. And I think the short format of the Wall Street Journal films for us lends to a discussion that becomes part of the national discussion as we continue with these salon-style events. So
Yes.
thank you all for being here. This is a
And braving the
great
weather.
audience
Yeah.
on a terrible
The
night.
courageous ones.
Thank you guys very much. Thank you. Thank you, Margo.
Yeah.